knows where all the stone went that was excavated from this place, and you're talking about tons and tons and tons of stone that had to be removed from each one of these places. And if you can get a sense of scale here of how big this place is, you're talking about 24 caves in total. This is just one.
A single cave in eastern China is bigger than an aircraft hangar. There are 24 of them, all hand-carved from solid rock, all 30 meters underground. Together, they cover 30,000 square meters. That is 4 full-size football pitches, carved by hand, underground, 2,000 years ago.
They've been determined to be more than 2,000 years old, and their construction is not recorded in any historical documents.
1 million cubic meters of stone was removed to build them. That is enough to fill 400 Olympic swimming pools, and nobody knows where it went. No tools were left behind. No records were written. In 2,000 years of Chinese history, one of the most documented civilizations ever, not one word about these caves exists.
Nobody builds something that big underground just for fun.
They were found by accident in 1992, under a pond, by a farmer with a pump. And after 30 years of investigation, archaeologists still cannot answer 3 basic questions. Who built them? How? And why? What is actually down there? To understand why the Longyu Caves are impossible, you first need to understand what they actually are, because the words cave and underground chamber do not come close to capturing what was built here. Each of the 24 caves descends approximately 30 meters below the surface. The average floor area of each individual cave is over 1,000 square meters. Some are significantly larger, up to 3,000 square meters. The ceiling height ranges from 10 to 30 meters. These are not tunnels. They are not crawl spaces. They are vast, open underground chambers with soaring ceilings and floor space larger than most modern buildings. Inside each cave, the structure is identical in its essential form. A single entrance connected to a vertical shaft with a carved stone staircase, walls that descend at a slight inward angle, giving each cave the shape of an inverted trapezoid when viewed from above. Widest at the ceiling, slightly narrower at the floor. 3 to 4 massive stone pillars, each one rising from floor to ceiling, positioned at geometrically regular intervals to distribute the load of the rock above. Stone bridges spanning the interior, gutters and drainage channels carved into the floor to manage water, and covering every single surface, every wall, every ceiling, every pillar, every bridge. A uniform pattern of chisel marks arranged in parallel diagonal lines, 60 centimeters wide, struck at precisely 60 degrees to the axis of each band. The consistency of this pattern is one of the most striking things about the caves. It is not decorative in any obvious sense. It does not depict scenes or figures or symbols. It is purely geometric. Diagonal bands of parallel lines, covering every surface with a regularity that suggests not artistic expression, but systematic, disciplined craft, applied at enormous scale by a workforce operating to a single shared standard. Whoever built these caves did not just carve them, they finished them. Every surface was treated with the same care, the same technique, the same angle of chisel strike. This was not a quarrying operation where stone was removed as efficiently as possible and the resulting surfaces left rough. This was construction. The walls and ceilings were worked to a standard, and that standard was maintained consistently across 30,000 square meters of underground space. There are also carvings. In one of the caves, the only one currently open to the public, the walls contain carved images of a fish, a horse, and a bird. These are rendered in a style consistent with Han Dynasty stone carving, which places their creation somewhere between 200 BC and 200 AD. A single headless stone statue has been found inside the complex. A small number of ceramic fragments were recovered from the silt on the cave floors, dated to the period between approximately 90 and 48 BC, the reign of Emperor Xuan of the Western Han Dynasty. These fragments are the only physical evidence found inside the caves that connects them to any specific point in history. They tell us the caves were there during the Han Dynasty. They do not tell us when the caves were built, by whom, or for what purpose. The scale of what was removed. The number that stops every engineer who encounters it is this one: 1 million cubic meters. That is the estimated volume of stone removed from the ground to create the Longyu Caves. 1 million cubic meters of solid siltstone, carved out by hand using bronze chisels and hammers, carried out of 24 separate underground chambers through their single narrow entrances, and taken somewhere. Somewhere. Because here is the problem. 1 million cubic meters of excavated stone is not a small thing to dispose of. It is an enormous thing, a city-building quantity of material. Piled up, it would form a hill visible for kilometers. Spread across a landscape, it would leave an obvious and permanent mark on the terrain. Dumped in a river, it would dam the river. Burned, which you cannot do with stone, it would be visible for days. 1 million cubic meters of stone had to go somewhere, and nobody has found it. There are no spoil heaps near the site, no archaeological evidence of stone being transported away from the area, no record in any document of a major quarrying or construction operation producing this quantity of material in this region. The land around the caves shows no sign of having received 1 million cubic meters of excavated siltstone. The stone that was removed to create these caves has, to all archaeological appearances, simply vanished, taken somewhere by someone for some purpose, and left no trace in the historical record. This is one of the most straightforward and yet most baffling facts about the Longyu Caves. Before you even ask who built them or why, there is a prior question that has never been answered. Where did 1 million cubic meters of rock go? Some researchers have proposed that the stone was used as building material, quarried deliberately to supply construction projects elsewhere. This would explain both why the caves were carved and where the stone went. But it raises an immediate problem. If the Longyu Caves were a quarry operation, if their purpose was the extraction of stone for use elsewhere, why were they finished with such extraordinary care? Why were the walls and ceilings covered in uniform decorative patterns? Why were pillars left in place to support the ceiling, rather than being removed along with the rest of the stone? Why were rooms and bridges and drainage channels built inside what should have been a purely functional extraction site? A quarry does not look like this. Nothing that has ever been identified as a quarry looks like this. The Longyu Caves were not built to extract stone. They were built to be something. And what that something was remains completely unknown. The engineering that should not have been possible. Every engineer who has studied the Longyu Caves reaches the same conclusion. The structural design is correct. This sounds like faint praise. It is not. Creating a stable underground chamber 30 meters deep, with a ceiling spanning thousands of square meters, with walls thin enough in some places to be only 50 centimeters thick, using nothing but hand tools and carved stone pillars, and having that chamber remain structurally intact for 2,000 years, through floods, seismic activity, and the weight of 30 meters of rock above it, requires a precise understanding of load distribution, stone mechanics, and underground structural engineering. The positioning of the pillars in each cave is not random. They are placed at geometrically regular intervals calculated to distribute the load of the ceiling across the available support points with maximum efficiency. The angle of the walls, slightly inward, creating the inverted trapezoid shape, transfers load downward and outward in a way that stabilizes the structure against the lateral pressure of the surrounding rock. The slope of the ceiling, descending at approximately 45 degrees from the entrance toward the back of each cave, manages the distribution of overhead weight in a way that reduces the stress on the supporting pillars. These are not accidental features. They are engineering choices, made by someone who understood, at least intuitively, and probably through accumulated practical knowledge, exactly how underground rock behaves under load and how to build a structure that would last. What makes this remarkable is the era in which these choices were made. The Longyu Caves were carved, based on the best available evidence, somewhere between 500 BC and 200 AD. At that point in history, the principles of underground structural engineering as a formal discipline did not exist anywhere in the world. The Romans were building their aqueducts and their arched bridges at roughly the same period, above-ground engineering of extraordinary sophistication, but systematic underground construction at this scale, with this degree of structural precision, has no known parallel in the ancient world. Chinese engineering of the period was advanced in many respects. The Great Wall was under construction. Large hydraulic projects were being undertaken. But nothing in the known record of ancient Chinese engineering comes close to the scale and structural complexity of the Longyu Caves. The people who built them knew what they were doing. They had a plan, a standard, and a deep understanding of what it takes to carve 30 meters into the earth and keep the ceiling up. Where they learned this, where this knowledge came from, is another question that has no answer. The chisel marks and what they tell us. The uniform pattern of chisel marks covering every surface of the Longyu Caves is both the most visually striking feature of the site and, in some ways, the most revealing. The marks were made with bronze tools. Archaeologists are confident of this, based on the characteristics of the cuts and the tools available during the period when the caves were most likely built. Each mark is a single strike of a chisel driven at a specific angle into the stone surface. The marks are arranged in parallel lines within 60-centimeter wide bands, and those bands are oriented at 60 degrees to the axis of the cave wall or ceiling they cover. This angle, 60 degrees, is consistent across all 24 caves. It does not vary, it does not drift. A worker at one end of the cave complex and a worker at the other end were making their chisel strikes at the same angle, to the same spacing, in the same direction. This level of standardization across 30,000 square meters of underground surface, worked by what must have been hundreds or thousands of people over an extended period of time, implies something important. It implies supervision, organization, a shared technical standard enforced across an entire workforce. Someone, some authority, some foreman, some system of quality control was ensuring that every chisel strike across every surface in every one of these 24 separate caves conformed to the same standard. This is the behavior of a state project, a project with resources, with hierarchy, with the kind of administrative infrastructure that can coordinate hundreds of workers across multiple sites and hold them to a single technical specification. The Longyu Caves were not dug by a small group of people following an individual's vision. They were built by an organization. And yet no organization has ever been identified. No emperor ordered this in any record that survives. No general, no minister, no provincial governor left any trace of having commissioned or overseen the construction of 24 enormous underground chambers in Zhejiang province. The organization that built the Longyu Caves was large enough, disciplined enough, and technically sophisticated enough to carve 1 million cubic meters of rock to a single standard, and it left no fingerprint in the historical record whatsoever. The chisel marks are there. The organization that made them is gone without a trace. The silence of the historical record. China, during the period when the Longyu Caves were most likely built, was not a historically silent civilization. It was one of the most literate and administratively detailed societies in the ancient world. The Han Dynasty, which most archaeologists believe was the period during or before which the caves were in use, maintained extraordinarily thorough records. Imperial edicts, tax records, census documents, military dispatches, engineering reports, and literary works from this period survive in enormous quantity. Chinese historiography stretching back to this era documents everything from crop yields to border skirmishes to the construction of major public works. The records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Qian in the 1st century BC, covers Chinese history in meticulous detail, going back centuries before his time. Not one surviving document from any of this vast literary and administrative tradition mentions the Longyu Caves. Not as a construction project, not as a completed structure, not as a landmark, not as a place where something happened, not even in passing, in a list of the notable features of Zhejiang province. This silence is not what you would expect from a project of this scale. Building 24 underground chambers covering 30,000 square meters, removing 1 million cubic meters of stone, and doing all of it to the standard of finish found in the Longyu Caves would have required significant resources, significant labor, significant time, significant organization. In the Han Dynasty, projects of this scale were noticed, recorded, and attributed. The construction of major walls, canals, palaces, and tombs all appear in the historical record. The Longyu Caves do not. The only historical document that references them at all is a poem written in the 17th century AD, over 1,000 years after the Han Dynasty ended, by a man named Yu Shun. The poem mentions the caves but provides no information about their origin or purpose. It simply notes that they exist. This is what the entire written record of 2,000 years of Chinese civilization says about the Longyu Caves, that they exist, nothing more. The theories, and why none of them hold. Over the 30 years since the caves were discovered, researchers have proposed many explanations for what they were built for. Every single one of these theories has a problem. The most commonly cited theory is that the caves were built as a military installation, specifically as a hiding place for the army of King Gujian of Yue, who suffered a catastrophic defeat in battle in 494 BC and needed somewhere to shelter his forces while he rebuilt his military strength. The theory was put forward in 2014 by Yang Hongshun of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and it has the advantage of providing a specific historical figure and event that could plausibly explain why such a large underground complex would be needed. The problem is the entrances. Each of the 24 caves has a single entrance, a vertical shaft approximately wide enough for 2 people to pass through at once. An army of any meaningful size could not enter or exit these caves quickly. They would be trapped underground with a single exit point, which is about the worst tactical position imaginable. A military commander who chose to hide his army in the Longyu Caves would not be preparing for a comeback. He would be preparing for a siege he could not survive. The second major theory is that the caves served as an imperial storage complex. Warehouses for grain, weapons, and supplies built under the orders of Emperor Xuan of the Western Han Dynasty, whose reign corresponds to the dating of the ceramic fragments found inside. The caves are large enough to store enormous quantities of material. Their underground location would keep temperatures stable, and imperial warehousing was a significant state function in the Han Dynasty. The problem here is water. The caves flood. They have always flooded. They were discovered because they were full of water, and before the farmers drained them in 1992, they had apparently been underwater for centuries. An underground storage facility that fills with water whenever it rains is not a functional storage facility. The drainage channels carved into the cave floors would have helped manage water infiltration, but could not have prevented the kind of flooding that kept the caves submerged for hundreds of years. Storing grain or wooden weapon parts in conditions prone to flooding would result in loss, not preservation. A third theory proposes that the caves were a mausoleum, a burial complex built for a king or emperor of the Wu Yue period. The scale of the construction and the quality of the finish are consistent with the kind of effort ancient Chinese rulers invested in their tombs, and the presence of the carved fish, horse, and bird figures in one cave could be consistent with the symbolic imagery found in elite burial contexts. The problem here is the absence of everything you would expect from a mausoleum. No burial chamber has been found, no sarcophagus, no funerary objects, no human remains, no inscription identifying the deceased. Ancient Chinese tombs, including those of relatively minor nobles, are typically identifiable by their burial goods, their inscriptions, and their structural layout. The Longyu Caves have none of these identifying features. The quarry theory, that the caves were simply a source of building stone, has already been discussed. It fails to explain the finish, the pillars, the drainage systems, and the carvings. You do not decorate a quarry. A more speculative theory proposes a ceremonial or religious function, that the caves were built as a sacred space for Taoist practice or ancestor worship, or some other form of ritual activity. The acoustic properties of the caves are extraordinary. Sound travels and resonates inside them in ways that could make them genuinely impressive spaces for ritual purposes. But without any evidence of the specific rituals performed, any sacred objects left behind, or any textual reference to the caves as a place of worship, this theory cannot be substantiated. None of these theories has been accepted. None of them fully accounts for the evidence. The caves remain, in the formal assessment of every research institution that has studied them, purpose unknown. The no-fish problem. Among all the strange facts about the Longyu Caves, there is one that tends to get overlooked in favor of the bigger structural and historical questions, but it is worth pausing on. The region of Zhejiang province where the caves are located is known for its naturally occurring underground water systems. The ponds and caves in the area, the natural ones, teem with aquatic life, fish, invertebrates, the normal biological community of a dark, water-filled underground space that has been connected to the surrounding water table for thousands of years. When the farmers pumped the Longyu Caves dry in 1992, after 17 days of draining, the water that came out was clean, and the caves, when the last of it was gone, contained no fish, no invertebrates, no evidence of any aquatic life whatsoever. A cave that has been full of water for centuries, connected, however loosely, to the surrounding water table, should contain life. Water finds its way in. Life follows water. The natural caves in the same region are full of it. The Longyu Caves were not. The explanation most researchers offer is that the caves are sealed more completely than they appear, that the siltstone walls are dense enough to prevent the slow seepage that would allow organisms to colonize the water inside. This is plausible. Siltstone can be very dense, but it is worth noting that this level of impermeability, if accurate, is itself another indicator of the quality of the stone selected and the precision of the carving. Whoever chose this location for their construction project chose a stone that, 2,000 years later, would prove dense enough to keep the interior water biologically isolated from the surrounding water table. Whether that was deliberate or coincidental is impossible to say, but it is one more detail that does not fit comfortably into the image of a simple ancient quarry or storage facility. The structural survival. The Longyu Caves have been underground for at least 2,000 years. During that time, the region of Zhejiang province has experienced floods, earthquakes, and the full range of geological and meteorological events that 2 millennia of Chinese history brings. The caves show no structural damage, not in the walls, not in the ceilings, not in the pillars. Some of the walls are 50 centimeters thick, less than the width of an average human arm span, supporting 30 meters of rock above them. By any conventional structural calculation, walls this thin under this load should have failed centuries ago. They have not. The pillars are positioned with a precision that modern structural engineers, studying the caves, describe as optimal for the load they carry. Not good for ancient construction. Optimal. As in, if a contemporary engineer were given the same space and the same task of supporting the ceiling with the minimum number of pillars, they might choose placements close to identical to those already there. The ceiling slopes, the walls angle, the drainage channels function. The whole structure, carved from stone by hand 2,000 years ago, behaves as if it were designed by someone who understood, in detail, the mechanical properties of the material and the forces acting on the structure. Zhejiang province is not seismically quiet. Earthquakes have occurred in the region during the 2,000 years these caves have been underground. The stone around the caves has shifted, settled, and adjusted in the way that geology always does over long periods of time. The caves have absorbed all of it without cracking. This is not luck. This does not happen by accident. A structure that survives 2,000 years of geological activity in a seismically active region, with walls 50 centimeters thick under 30 meters of rock, was designed to survive. Whoever built the Longyu caves built them to last. They were not wrong. The parallel lines and the question of meaning. The chisel marks covering the surfaces of the Longyu caves have been analyzed from a practical engineering standpoint, as evidence of tool use, work organization, and technical standard. But they have also been examined as potential carriers of meaning. The pattern is too consistent to be purely functional. You do not need to finish a cave wall with thousands of precisely aligned parallel lines in order to make it structurally sound. The lines serve no load-bearing or waterproofing purpose. They are on the ceiling as well as the walls, a surface that has no practical function that would require this treatment. They are on the pillars, they are on the bridges, they are everywhere, applied to every surface with the same care and the same standard. This is deliberate decoration. The builders of the Longyu caves chose to cover every surface with this pattern. They invested significant additional labor beyond what was needed to simply carve and support the caves, in applying this finish uniformly across 30,000 square meters of underground space. Why? Some researchers have suggested the pattern has symbolic significance, that the diagonal lines represent water, or waves, or some cosmological concept important to the culture that built the caves. The horizontal arrangement of the lines in some sections of the caves creates, as one researcher described it, a rhythmic sense of waves, an undulating visual effect when viewed along the length of a wall. If this interpretation is correct, the builders were not just constructing a functional space. They were making something that was meant to feel like something, an environment, a designed interior that communicated meaning through its visual character. But this interpretation cannot be confirmed. Without knowing who built the caves or what cultural framework they operated within, the meaning of the pattern, if it has one, cannot be established. It could be symbolic, it could be purely aesthetic, it could be a craft tradition whose purpose was simply excellence for its own sake, the mark of a culture that believed that any surface worth carving was worth carving well. What is certain is that the pattern took an extraordinary amount of work to produce, and that work was done consistently, to a standard, across every surface in every cave. Whatever the reason, the builders of the Longyu caves cared about this. It mattered to them, and it matters to us now because it is the clearest evidence we have that these caves were built by people with a culture, with values, with aesthetic sensibility, with a specific idea of what a finished thing should look like. We just do not know who those people were. What has been found, and what has not. 30 years of archaeological work at the Longyu caves has produced a frustratingly thin evidence base for such a significant site. The ceramic fragments dated to the Western Han Dynasty are the most useful find. They establish that the caves were in use, or at least accessible, during a period roughly 2,000 years ago. They do not establish when the caves were built, only that they existed at that point. The carved images of the fish, horse, and bird in the single accessible cave are stylistically consistent with Han Dynasty stone carving. They suggest that someone during the Han period chose to decorate at least one of the caves with meaningful imagery. But they do not tell us whether the caves were built in the Han period or were already ancient by the time the carvings were added. The headless stone statue found inside the complex is unidentified. Its stylistic characteristics have not been precisely matched to any known period or tradition. It may be contemporary with the caves themselves, or may have been placed there later. Without an inscription or clear stylistic attribution, its age and significance cannot be determined. What has not been found is equally significant: no tools. The workers who carved 1 million cubic meters of stone left no bronze chisels, no wooden handles, no oil lamps, no food remains, no personal belongings of any kind inside the caves. Construction sites, even very old ones, typically leave material evidence of the people who worked on them. The Longyu caves have been cleaned out, either deliberately, as part of completing the project, or by the flooding that eventually submerged them. No human remains. If these caves served as a mausoleum or a place of burial, the burials have not been found. If workers died during construction, which at this scale over this depth would be expected, their remains are not present. No inscriptions naming the builder, the commissioner, the purpose, or the date. Ancient Chinese construction projects of significant scale were typically marked with inscriptions. The caves have none. The archaeological record of the Longyu caves is almost completely empty. 2,000 square meters per cave, 24 caves, 30 years of excavation, and the total inventory of what has been found would fit in a small room. Either the caves were deliberately stripped of evidence before being abandoned, or whatever they contained was removed before they flooded, or they were used in a way that simply did not leave the kind of material residue that archaeologists can work with. Any of these explanations is possible. None of them is satisfying. The Hashan grottos, and what they suggest. 200 kilometers to the northwest of the Longyu caves, on the banks of the Shinan River in Anhui Province, there is another complex of underground stone chambers. The Hashan grottos share many of the Longyu caves' most striking characteristics: the same style of carved pillars, the same systematic approach to the interior finish, the same absence of historical documentation explaining their origin. The Hashan grottos were likely built later than the Longyu caves. Lichenometric dating and analysis of archaeological finds within them suggest a construction date around the Jin Dynasty period, roughly 265 to 439 AD, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years after the most likely construction date of the Longyu caves. Their existence changes the interpretive landscape significantly. The Longyu caves, taken alone, could theoretically be a unique anomaly. One extraordinary unexplained project carried out by one extraordinary unknown builder at one specific moment in history. That kind of anomaly, while puzzling, is at least conceivable. But the Hashan grottos suggest something different. They suggest a tradition, a technique of underground construction, a specific approach to carving stone chambers with pillar supports, finished surfaces, and no historical record that was practiced in this region of China across multiple periods by people who apparently shared no documentation of what they were doing. If there is a tradition, there is a culture, a group of people, or a succession of groups who built this way, who understood this technique, who passed it down through generations outside the official historical record. A tradition invisible to the imperial administration, invisible to the literary culture, invisible to every subsequent period of Chinese civilization that has looked for it. What that tradition was, who carried it, and why it left no trace in any written source, is a question that the discovery of the Hashan grottos makes more urgent and more fascinating, and no easier to answer. What we actually know. After 30 years of research by some of the best minds in archaeology, engineering, architecture, geology, and history, here is the honest summary of what is known about the Longyu caves. They are at least 2,000 years old. The ceramic evidence places human activity inside them during the Western Han Dynasty. The stylistic characteristics of the carvings are consistent with this period or earlier. They were built by hand, using bronze tools, by a large and organized workforce operating to a single technical standard across all 24 caves. Their structural design is correct and sophisticated. The positioning of pillars, the angle of walls, and the slope of ceilings reflect a genuine understanding of underground load distribution that has kept the caves intact for 2 millennia. Approximately 1 million cubic meters of stone was removed to create them. That stone has not been found. No historical document in over 2,000 years of Chinese writing mentions their construction, their purpose, or their builders. Every theory proposed to explain their function fails to account for some significant aspect of the evidence. And that is where the knowledge ends. Not because researchers have not tried, not because the caves have not been studied, but because the evidence simply does not exist to answer the questions. The Longyu caves are an engineering achievement of the first order, more impressive in their structural execution than many things built in the ancient world that we know a great deal about. They represent an investment of human labor, skill, and organization that by any measure qualifies as a major historical event in the region where they were built. and they have been completely, utterly, and apparently deliberately erased from every record. That erasure is itself a mystery, because silence on this scale does not happen accidentally. 2,000 years of Chinese civilization, meticulous in its record-keeping, did not simply forget to write down the construction of 30,000 square meters of underground architecture. Something happened to this knowledge. Either it was never recorded, which would be extraordinary in a culture that recorded almost everything, or it was recorded and the records were destroyed or lost, which would require a deliberate act or a catastrophic one, or it was never written down, because the people who built these caves operated outside the literate, administrative culture of their era. None of these options makes the mystery smaller. Each one raises a different and equally unanswerable question. The caves are there, 30 meters underground, perfect, silent, waiting for an explanation that has not arrived in over 2,000 years. 24 caves, 30,000 square meters, 1 million cubic meters of stone, 2,000 years old, and not one word about them in any historical record ever found. The Longyu Caves are the greatest construction mystery on Earth, not because they are supernatural, not because they defy physics, but because something this big, built by this many people to this standard, simply should not have been forgotten. And it was. What do you think was down there? Drop your theory in the comments. Next week we are going to the Baalbek megaliths in Lebanon. Stones so large that no modern crane can lift them, cut and moved by a civilization nobody has identified. Subscribe so you do not miss it. See you then.